Perhaps we view this issue very differently, and oftentimes, whenever we try to discuss it, we end up arguing and yelling at each other and not really listening. Eventually, it devolves into name calling, and then all we can really do is agree to disagree. But to agree to disagree suggests that we're not articulate enough to sufficiently explain our positions to each other, or that each other's questions about this issue are not valid questions. But if this issue is what we argue that it is, a woman's health issue, a human right, or perhaps maybe even a living human person, whichever of those positions turns out to actually be true, all of those positions deserve more precise articulation than just cussing each other out. I'm making this video because I believe that each of us has legitimate and valid questions about the other's position, and that those questions deserve to be heard and answered. I believe that there are some of us on both sides of this issue who are willing and able to carefully listen to and answer those questions. If that's not you, and you're just angry and looking for someone to cuss out, then this video is not for you. But I hope you'll stay, because next I will ask my legitimate and valid questions. But first, as always, we start with our mission. Always remember, God created us for this time and for this place. If we learn this faith, if we live this faith, if we share this faith, what will the next 100 years look like? Join the mission. I have often wondered, during the protests and the rallies, it's common to see signs or to hear people chanting phrases such as, "my body, my choice." And it's always been my assumption that these are nothing more than political slogans, not necessarily universal and dogmatic principles. But lately I've begun to question whether or not that is actually correct, which is what initiated this video. What I mean is, when you say it is a woman's right to choose, is that just something that someone says during a protest or a rally, something that gets printed on a bumper sticker? Or is that truly a guiding principle of life that can never be broken? This is an important question because many of these slogans raise legitimate follow-up questions. For example, what do you mean by a woman's right to choose? Or how do you know that a fetus is not a living human person? If these slogans are in fact infallible, dogmatic, universal principles, by my simply asking these questions, I inadvertently put myself in the position of offending you by violating a principle that you hold to be sacred and dear. And that's not my intention at all. My intention is to understand what it is that you are thinking and how it is that you've come to the conclusions that you've made. And conversely, to express what it is that I am thinking and how it is that I've come to my own conclusions. It is important to explain what you mean, or else people may be confused about your position. I admit that I am. Now, confusion typically occurs when terms are ambiguous. The result is that two different things that may look similar are confused for one another. People struggle to distinguish between them. It may be that all we need to do is clarify what we mean when we use particular terms. So when you say, "it is my body, my choice," that women have a moral right to decide what to do with their bodies, and just to get this out there, that's not a position that I'm going to oppose. But when you say this, do you mean this as a political slogan or as a universal principle? To articulate the position as best as I understand it, I will refer to an article from the BBC called Ethics, Arguments in Favor of Abortion. The BBC says, "Many people regard the right to control one's own body as a key moral right. If women are not allowed to abort an unwanted fetus, they are deprived of this right. The simplest form of the women's rights argument in favor of abortion goes like this. A woman has the right to decide what she can and can't do with her body. The fetus exists inside a woman's body. A woman has the right to decide whether the fetus remains in her body. Therefore, a pregnant woman has the right to abort the fetus." A PDF provided by Planned Parenthood says, "Abortion is a deeply personal and often complex decision. Help people think outside their bubble, saying, 'I don't know a person's specific situation,' or 'I'm not in her shoes.'" And a PDF from Pro-Choice America, also known as NARAL, says, "When people are making difficult, complicated personal medical decisions, one-size-fits-all laws don't work. We cannot make a woman's decision because we haven't walked in her shoes." Notice all three of these sources seem to present this argument not as a political slogan, but as a universal principle that can never be violated. But I bet you see where I'm going now, because this universal principle raises an obvious follow-up question, a valid question that deserves a response, because there are things that a woman could do to her own body by choice that we all recognize as harmful. I'm thinking of eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia. What about opioid addiction? What about the cutting, which has become so common lately? A psych nurse recently told me about a whole series of things that are categorized as self-harm, things like banging your head against a wall or burning yourself or punching yourself. Now, in all of these things, there's properly a social expectation that we should intervene despite the woman's universal right to choose. Would anyone realistically argue that we shouldn't help her because she has the right to choose what she does with her body? When we introduce harm or danger into the equation, does that change the dynamics of the argument? Should the principle then be, this is my body, and I choose not to allow harm to be done to my body? If that's the principle, is that a principle that we could all agree with? If so, then the question becomes, does abortion cause harm? If it can be shown that abortion causes harm to a living human person, would we then view this issue differently? Would that move the discussion away from the "this is my body, my choice" political slogan to, instead, we need to help people who are in danger of being harmed? I think most of us agree up to this point, but moving on from here, saying that a fetus is a living human person is where we've had the problem. So either we can show that a fetus is a living human person or we can't. But if we can, then maybe we can start to find common ground on this issue. So first, let's look at what it means to be living. What does it mean to be alive, and when does life begin? The Planned Parenthood PDF mentioned earlier addresses this question, saying questions about when life began are personal, and it's just not that simple. For some, it's based on faith. For others, it's a matter of science or medicine. One thing we do know is that politicians aren't the experts. Now, honestly, this statement seems to be somewhat disingenuous. Rather than answering the question, it seems to be confusing the issue. Remember earlier when I said confusion typically occurs when terms are ambiguous? The result is that two different things that may look similar are confused for one another. Instead of stating the scientific facts, this quote presents life as something subjective, something that is personal, it's based on faith, not on science. But before we even crack open these science texts, I would like to point out that recognizing life is not nearly as complicated as they say it is. To be alive, Webster's dictionary says, is having life, not dead or inanimate. This plant is alive, and this can be confirmed by scientific observations of several functions: order, cells, growth and development, energy processing, regulation, response to environment, reproduction, and evolution. This rock, on the other hand, is inanimate. It does none of those 7 functions. So we say that this is living, this is not living, and we can observe the life in this object from the first moment of its existence until that day in which it is no longer alive, and then we say it is dead. We cannot observe that it goes in and out of periods of living and dying. It begins, then it is always alive, until finally it is dead. This Pearson biology textbook on page 10 and 11 says, "What is life? Or to put it another way, what distinguishes living things from non-living things? The phenomenon of life seems to defy a simple one-sentence definition, yet even a small child instinctively knows that a bug or a plant is alive, but a rock is not. If someone placed an object in front of you and asked whether it was alive, what would you do? Would you poke it to see if it reacts? Would you watch it closely to see if it moves or breathes? Would you dissect it to look at its parts?" Each of these ideas is closely related to how biologists actually define life. We recognize life mainly by what living things do. Using the green sea turtle as an example, figure 111 highlights the major properties we associate with life: order, cells, growth and development, energy processing, regulation, response to the environment, reproduction, and evolution. An object is generally considered to be alive if it displays all of these characteristics simultaneously. On the other hand, a non-living object may display some of these properties, but not all of them. For example, a virus has an ordered structure, but it cannot process energy, nor is it composed of cells. Viruses, therefore, are generally not considered to be a living organism. So we generally know what constitutes a living thing. Can we use that information to determine when human life begins? Yes. As soon as each of those properties can be observed, then we can scientifically state that life has begun. This was demonstrated in 2019 by Dr. Steve Jacobs in his dissertation, Balancing Abortion Rights and Fetal Rights. In his study, he surveyed 5,577 biologists, professors in the biology department of over 1,000 institutions. The survey included questions about political affiliation, revealing that 89% of those surveyed identified as liberal and 85% of them as pro-choice. Yet still, 96%, that's 5,337 biologists, 96% agreed with the statement that human life begins at the moment of conception or fertilization. Notice that this scientific data dramatically contradicts Planned Parenthood's PDF, which says questions about when life began are personal, and it's just not that simple. For some, it's based on faith. For others, it's a matter of science or medicine. One thing we do know is that politicians aren't the experts. Also notice that none of this data includes dependency as a factor. I've heard it argued that a fetus is not a living human person because it is dependent upon the mother's body for survival. Check out this statement by Robin at urge.org. An important thing to remember about pregnancy is that fetuses are dependent on the pregnant person's body in order to stay alive. And because of an idea called bodily autonomy, for example, the reason that you can't be forced to donate organs even if it would save a person's life, we cannot make a person continue a pregnancy when they do not want to. I would also point out that it isn't right for someone to decide whether a person has to continue a pregnancy that might negatively impact them physically, socially, and financially. Robin wants to shift away from the idea of life towards this concept of dependency. But does dependency negate life? Does dependency cause something to not be alive? To claim that this plant is not alive because it's dependent upon the soil in the pot, it's embedded in the soil, so therefore it's not actually alive? Well, that is to add the concept of independence to the definition. But if we did that, if we added independence to the definition of what it means to be alive, then could anything be considered to be alive? After all, everything is dependent entirely upon its surroundings for survival. Nothing that we call alive is entirely independent. As a matter of fact, of those 8 properties of life, energy processing, regulation, and response to the environment all necessitate some degree of dependence. So based on this scientific definition, to be alive actually necessitates being dependent. So a fetus, despite being dependent upon her mother, is alive from the first moment of conception. But is a living fetus a human? Human parents conceive human children, correct? There is no known instance of humans conceiving other species. If there is something naturally conceived inside of a human, then it must be human. If we were doing taxonomy, no one here would argue that a fetus should have a separate classification from an adult human. A tadpole is developing into an adult frog, but we call that growth and development. That was actually one of the features of a living organism. We don't then place the tadpole in a different classification group because they're undergoing growth, do we? No, we classify them with their parents, frogs. David Boonin, author of A Defense of Abortion, states, "The most straightforward relationship between you and me on the one hand and every human fetus on the other is that we are all living members of the same species, Homo sapiens. A human fetus, after all, is simply a human being at a very early stage in his or her development. Peter Singer, author of Practical Ethics, states, whether a being is a member of a given species is something that can be determined scientifically by an examination of the nature of the chromosomes in the cells of living organisms. In this sense, there is no doubt that from the first moments of its existence, an embryo conceived from human sperm and egg is a human being. So then this brings us to the most abstract part of the question. A fetus is scientifically a living human, but is it a living human person? Philosopher Marianne Warren introduced the concept of personhood. She gave 5 conditions for a being to be a person: consciousness, reasoning, self-motivated activity, capacity to communicate, and self-awareness. This list is very troublesome because all 5 of those conditions would depend greatly upon the development or upon the health of a living thing. For example, consciousness eliminates people who are in a coma, but they are legally people according to their medical charts. Reasoning potentially eliminates people with special needs, but they are legally people according to their birth certificates. Self-motivated activity eliminates most teenagers, but they are legally people according to their driver's licenses. Capacity to communicate eliminates Helen Keller and most children below 18 months of age. Self-awareness also eliminates children arguably below 18 months of age. And this is where the problem in this argument resides. The confusion of these terms leads to a tendency to separate humanity from personhood. We are not confused about what this is. This is a plant. But notice that it is not every plant. It's just this plant. There's other plants. And if this plant died, there would still be other plants. This plant is just one instance of what it means to be a plant. To be a plant answers the question, what is this? It is a plant. But this particular is not every plant. It's just this individual plant. Notice there are no plants anywhere in the world except in separate individual plants. The universal concept of plant is actualized only in specific individuals. Likewise, to be a human answers the question, what are we? We are human, each of us. But none of us encompasses all humanity. Humanity is a universal concept that transcends each individual. To be a person answers a different question. To be human answers the question, what are we? While to be a person answers the question, who are we? Who is the individual? I'm Brad, you are Tony or Kathy, and there's no instance of a real living human that was not an actualized individual with an identity that we call a person. To say that a living human embryo is not a person is to separate what it means to be a person from what it means to be a human, to confuse the terms, and end up with the universal concept of human without an actualized individual when we can all scientifically observe an individual living human exists. This separation of what it means to be human from what it means to be a person is at the heart of extremist ideologies such as racism. To illustrate my point, I would like to share a story that I saw on CNN a few weeks ago while I was writing the script. Now, just a warning, this is pretty disturbing, but I won't show the images. If you're curious, you can go to CNN yourself. The headline, a Michigan high school biology teacher is on leave after distributing a worksheet with a disturbing racial offense. A biology teacher at a Michigan private school for gifted students is on administrative leave after distributing an assignment worksheet last week in which a picture of former U.S. President Barack Obama was included among pictures of several animals, including primates. The worksheet, which featured pictures of various animals and asked students to check off the pictures of primates, included a headshot of Obama between pictures of 2 animals. So this is offensive precisely because it separates what it means to be human, to have human dignity, from what it means to be a person. It takes the person of the president and implies that he should be categorized in another universal group with animals. This is historically how racism has functioned. It takes an individual person and categorizes him or her through laws and institutions into alternate categories such as animals or property, robbing the individual person of their human dignity. And here I'm making the case that an embryo is a living human person and that abortion robs this individual person of their human dignity by redefining them unscientifically as something else, something that is either not alive or as something that is not human, such as a clump of cells. And that ideology causes harm to a living human person. Now, I understand that there is much more to be said regarding Robin's idea of bodily autonomy, so I will address that argument further in a future video. Please subscribe so you don't miss that video when it comes out. And special thanks to Trent Horn for those great quotes from David Boonen, Peter Singer, and Dr. Steve Jacobs. These things, they're fleeting and they do not last, and we will never achieve this ideal state by which it becomes proper to have children, which may explain why millennials who were raised with this ideology, this pragmatic utilitarianism, are not getting married or having kids.